Black girl tells judge that she is hungry. What he did next left everyone in shock. Part 1. The Detroit City Courthouse stood tall and imposing on a cold Monday morning in October. Inside courtroom 7B, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as 12-year-old Keisha Thompson stood nervously before Judge Marcus Wilson. Her worn-out purple sweater hung loose on her thin frame, and her shoes had holes that she tried to hide by keeping her feet close together. The courtroom was unusually quiet that morning. Several police officers, court staff, and a handful of people waiting for their cases watched as the young girl shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Her dark brown eyes remained fixed on the floor, unable to meet the judge's gaze. Case number 2474, Keisha Thompson, announced the court clerk, her voice echoing through the room. Charged with petty theft from Mason's Corner Store on Oak Street. Judge Wilson, a man in his mid-50s with kind eyes and graying hair at his temples, looked down at the file on his desk. In his 15 years on the bench, he had seen many cases involving young people, but something about this one felt different. The girl before him wasn't showing the usual defiance or fear he often witnessed. Instead, she appeared exhausted and defeated. "Miss Thompson," Judge Wilson began, his voice gentle but firm, "do you understand why you're here today?" Keisha nodded slowly, still not looking up. "Yes, Your Honor," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the large courtroom. "Please speak up, young lady," the judge requested, leaning forward slightly. Finally raising her eyes, Keisha squared her thin shoulders. "Yes, Your Honor," she repeated, louder this time. "I took food from Mr. Mason's store." "Can you tell me what you took?" "2 loaves of bread, a jar of peanut butter, and some apples," Keisha replied, her voice trembling slightly. Mr. Mason, the store owner, sat in the first row. He was a short man with thick glasses and a usually stern expression, but today his face showed concern as he watched the young girl. "And why did you take these items instead of paying for them?" Judge Wilson asked, though something in his expression suggested he might already know the answer. The courtroom fell completely silent. Even the usual shuffling of papers and whispered conversation ceased. Keisha's hands gripped the edges of her sweater tightly as tears began to well up in her eyes. "I was hungry, Your Honor," she said, her voice cracking. "We haven't had proper food at home for days. My stomach was hurting so bad, and my little brother kept crying because he was hungry too." A soft gasp rippled through the courtroom. Judge Wilson noticed one of the court officers quickly wiping her eyes, while the usually stoic bailiff looked away, blinking rapidly. "Where are your parents, Keisha?" the judge asked, his tone softening even more. "My mom's at home with my brother. She lost her job at the factory 3 weeks ago. She's been trying to find work, but nobody's hiring." Keisha paused, taking a shaky breath. "We don't have a dad. He left when Tommy was just a baby." Judge Wilson removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, taking a moment to process what he'd heard. The girl standing before him wasn't a troublemaker or a thief. She was a child trying to survive. "Is your mother aware that you're here today?" he asked. Keisha shook her head. "No, Your Honor. She thinks I'm at school. I didn't want to worry her more. She already cries at night when she thinks we're sleeping." The judge looked around the courtroom, noting how every person present seemed moved by the young girl's story. Even Mr. Mason, who had initially been adamant about pressing charges, was now pulling out a handkerchief to wipe his eyes. "Keisha," Judge Wilson said, his voice firm but kind, "what you did was still wrong. Taking things that don't belong to you is against the law, no matter the reason. Do you understand that?" "Yes, Your Honor," Keisha replied, hanging her head again. "I'm sorry. I just didn't know what else to do." As Judge Wilson looked at the young girl standing before him, her worn clothes, her tired eyes, and her obvious shame, he knew that this case would require more than just standard legal proceedings. He reached for his gavel, but instead of announcing his decision, he did something that would soon have the entire courthouse talking. "We'll take a 15-minute recess," he declared, standing up from his bench. "Keisha, please wait here. There's something we need to discuss." To be continued. Black girl tells judge that she is hungry. What he did next left everyone in shock. Part 2. During the recess, Judge Wilson didn't return to his chambers as usual. Instead, he walked down to the courthouse cafeteria, speaking quietly with the manager, Maria Gonzalez. A few minutes later, He returned to the courtroom carrying a tray loaded with a warm bowl of chicken soup, fresh bread, and a tall glass of milk. The spectators in the courtroom watched in stunned silence as the distinguished judge, still in his black robes, carefully placed the tray on the defendant's table where Keisha stood. "First things first," he said gently, "let's take care of your immediate need. Please, sit down and eat." Keisha stared at the food, her eyes wide with disbelief. She looked around uncertainly, as if waiting for someone to tell her it was a mistake. When no one did, she slowly sat down, her hands trembling as she picked up the spoon. "Go ahead," Judge Wilson encouraged. "We can talk while you eat." As Keisha began to eat, trying her best to maintain proper manners despite her hunger, Judge Wilson pulled up a chair and sat nearby, removing his judicial robe. The action itself was unprecedented. Judges rarely left their bench during proceedings, let alone sat near defendants. "Now, Keisha," he began, his voice carrying the warmth of a concerned grandfather rather than the authority of a judge, "tell me more about your mother. How long did she work at the factory?" Between careful spoonfuls of soup, Keisha explained that her mother, Patricia Thompson, had worked at the local auto parts factory for 8 years. She had never missed a day of work until the factory closed down without warning, leaving hundreds of workers jobless. "She's been going to job interviews every day," Keisha added, pausing to wipe her mouth with a napkin. "But they all want computer skills, and Mom only knows factory work. She's trying to learn computers at the library, but it's hard with Tommy being so young." Mr. Mason, who had been listening intently, suddenly stood up from his seat. "Your Honor," he called out, "may I approach?" Judge Wilson nodded, and the store owner walked forward, wringing his hands nervously. I want to withdraw the charges," he said. "I had no idea about their situation. In fact," he turned to look at Keisha, "my wife and I could use some help at the store. Part-time work, but it's something. Maybe your mother would be interested." The judge smiled approvingly, but before he could respond, more people in the courtroom began speaking up. The court clerk mentioned that her church ran a food bank program. A police officer offered to connect Patricia with a job training program his wife coordinated. Even Maria from the cafeteria, who had followed the judge back to the courtroom, suggested she might have some openings on her staff. Keisha sat there, the empty soup bowl before her, tears streaming down her face, but these weren't tears of shame or fear anymore, they were tears of hope and gratitude. Judge Wilson raised his hands for silence. "Keisha, what you did was still wrong," he said firmly, "but I understand why you did it. Sometimes, good people make desperate choices when they feel they have no other options. However, there are always other options, we just need to know where to find them." He turned to the bailiff. "Please call Ms. Thompson and ask her to come to the courthouse immediately. Tell her it's about her daughter, but assure her that everything is all right." Looking back at Keisha, he added, "We're going to help your family, but you have to promise me something. Promise that you'll never steal again, no matter how difficult things get." "I promise, Your Honor," Keisha said earnestly, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. "I really do." "Good," the judge nodded. "And one more thing, you'll need to make things right with Mr. Mason. Community service at his store should do it, not as punishment, but as a way to learn and give back to the community. Would that be acceptable to you, Mr. Mason?" The store owner nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely, Your Honor." As they waited for Patricia Thompson to arrive, the courtroom buzzed with activity. People exchanged phone numbers and made plans to help. The same room that had earlier felt cold and intimidating now felt warm with humanity and compassion. Judge Wilson watched it all with satisfaction, knowing that sometimes justice wasn't about punishment. It was about understanding and helping people find their way back to hope. To be continued. Black girl tells judge that she is hungry. What he did next left everyone in shock. Part 3. 30 minutes later, Patricia Thompson rushed into the courtroom, her 4-year-old son Tommy clutching her hand. She was a tall, thin woman wearing a faded blue dress and a worn jacket. Her face showed the strain of recent hardships, but there was still pride in the way she carried herself. "Mama," Keisha called out, jumping up from her seat. Judge Wilson nodded, giving her permission to go to her mother. Patricia hugged her daughter tightly, then held her at arm's length, examining her face. "What's going on? Why aren't you in school? The bailiff said you were in court." Her voice trailed off as she finally took in her surroundings, her eyes widening with realization. "Mrs. Thompson," Judge Wilson said kindly, "please, come forward. Bring your son too." As Patricia approached the bench, little Tommy hiding behind her legs, the judge explained what had happened. With each word, Patricia's face shifted from confusion to shame to sorrow. When he described how Keisha had stolen food because they were hungry, Patricia covered her face with her hands. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I've been trying so hard to make the food last. I've been skipping meals so the children could eat more, but I didn't realize." Her voice broke. "Mom," Keisha said softly, "I saw you giving your portion to Tommy. I heard your stomach growling at night. I just wanted to help." The courtroom was silent except for a few sniffles from the spectators. Even little Tommy seemed to understand the seriousness of the moment, standing quietly beside his mother. Judge Wilson cleared his throat. "Mrs. Thompson, today we're not here to judge you or your daughter. We're here to help. Several members of our community have already offered assistance." He gestured to Mr. Mason, who stepped forward to explain about the part-time job. Maria from the cafeteria spoke about an immediate position she had available. The court clerk described the food bank program, and the police officer explained the job training opportunity. Patricia listened, overwhelmed by the sudden outpouring of support. "I don't know what to say," she said finally. "We've been so alone in this struggle. I was too proud to ask for help, too ashamed." "There's no shame in needing help," Judge Wilson interrupted gently. "The shame lies in seeing someone in need and doing nothing. That's why everyone here wants to help." Just then, Tommy tugged on his mother's dress. "Mama, I'm hungry," he whispered, though in the quiet courtroom, everyone heard him. Maria immediately stepped forward. "I'll get him something from the cafeteria," she offered, already heading toward the door. "Your Honor," Patricia began, but Judge Wilson held up his hand. "Mrs. Thompson, here's what we're going to do," he said firmly. "First, you and your children will have a proper meal in our cafeteria. Then, we'll work out a plan for moving forward. Mr. Mason has agreed to drop the charges against Keisha in exchange for some community service, which will be good experience for her." He continued, "You'll start work tomorrow, either with Mr. Mason or Maria, whichever suits your schedule better. The job training program can work around your working hours. The food bank will provide immediate assistance, and I'm going to personally connect you with some local organizations that can help with bills and other necessities until you're back on your feet." Patricia's shoulders straightened, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, she smiled. It was a small smile, but it held hope. "Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you, everyone. We won't let you down." "I know you won't," Judge Wilson replied. He looked at Keisha, who was now holding her little brother's hand. "Sometimes life tests us in ways we don't expect. What matters is not just how we face these tests, but how we help others facing similar challenges." As Maria returned with food for Tommy and the court clerk began taking down Patricia's information, Judge Wilson watched the scene with satisfaction. This was why he had become a judge. Not just to uphold the law, but to help guide people toward better paths when they lost their way. The Thompson family's story was far from over, but at least now they weren't walking their path alone. To be continued. Black girl tells judge that she is hungry. What he did next left everyone in shock. Part 4. 1 week had passed since that memorable day in Judge Wilson's courtroom. The Thompson family's life had begun to change in ways they never expected. Patricia had started working at Mr. Mason's store in the mornings and at the courthouse cafeteria in the afternoons. Her determination to succeed was evident in everything she did. On this particular morning, Patricia stood behind the counter at Mason's corner store, carefully arranging fresh fruits in a display basket. Mr. Mason watched approvingly as she greeted customers with a warm smile, already knowing many of them by name. "You're a natural at this, Patricia," Mr. Mason said, adjusting his thick glasses. "Customers have been commenting on how friendly and helpful you are." Patricia beamed with pride. The past week had restored something she thought she'd lost forever: her dignity. The store uniform she wore might not have been expensive, but it was clean and neat, and she wore it with pride. Meanwhile, at the courthouse cafeteria, Maria had taken young Keisha under her wing. After school each day, Keisha would come to the cafeteria to do her homework while her mother finished her shift. Today, Maria was teaching her how to make sandwiches for the next day's lunch crowd. Like this, Maria demonstrated, carefully layering the ingredients. Remember, we make each sandwich as if we're making it for someone we love. Keisha nodded seriously, following Maria's instructions. The same hands that had once stolen food were now learning to prepare it for others. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew their story. Little Tommy had also found his place in their new routine. The courthouse staff had fallen in love with the cheerful 4-year-old, who now spent his afternoons playing quietly in a corner of the cafeteria, surrounded by coloring books and toys donated by various employees. Judge Wilson made it a point to stop by the cafeteria each day, not as a judge, but as someone who cared about their progress. Today, he found Keisha struggling with her math homework. "May I?" he asked, pulling up a chair beside her. For the next 20 minutes, he patiently explained fractions, using sandwich portions as examples. It was a side of the stern judge that few people ever saw. Later that afternoon, Patricia attended her first computer class at the Job Training Center. The police officer's wife, Sarah, who ran the program, had arranged for Tommy to attend the center's free childcare service during the classes. "Today we're learning about email and basic word processing," Sarah announced to the class. Patricia sat in the front row, her face set in concentration as she carefully typed each letter. Her factory-worn hands were awkward on the keyboard, but her determination never wavered. Back at the store, Mr. Mason was teaching Keisha the importance of inventory management as part of her community service. "See these labels?" he explained, pointing to the prices. "Each one tells a story about what people need and what they can afford." Keisha listened intently, remembering how she had once viewed these same items only as things to steal. Now she was learning their true value, not just in dollars, but in the way they connected the community. The day ended with a surprise visit from Judge Wilson to Mason's corner store. He wasn't wearing his judicial robes, rather a simple sweater and slacks. He had come not for any official reason, but to check on the family's progress. "Your Honor." Keisha called out happily when she saw him. The judge smiled, noting how different she looked from the scared, hungry child who had stood before him just a week ago. "I see everyone settling in well," he observed, watching Patricia confidently operate the cash register while Tommy played with his toys in a safe corner behind the counter. "We are," Patricia replied, her eyes bright with unshed tears of gratitude. "I never thought we'd have this chance. The whole community has been so kind." "That's what community is for," Judge Wilson said simply. "We all need help sometimes. The true measure of a society is how we treat those who are struggling." As he left the store, Judge Wilson reflected on how a simple act of compassion had sparked a chain reaction of kindness throughout the community. The Thompson family's story was becoming more than just a tale of hunger and desperation. It was transforming into one of hope, redemption, and the power of human connection. To be continued. 1 month into their new life, the Thompson family faced their first big challenge. Patricia sat at their small kitchen table late one night, staring at the bills spread before her. Though she now had steady work, the backlog of unpaid rent and utilities from her period of unemployment loomed large. The apartment was warmer now, their refrigerator well-stocked thanks to their improved circumstances, but Patricia's worried expression reflected the weight of their remaining struggles. Keisha watched her mother from the doorway, remembering the promise she'd made to Judge Wilson about never stealing again, no matter how hard things got. "Mom," Keisha said softly, stepping into the kitchen. "Maybe we should talk to Judge Wilson." Patricia looked up, her pride warring with practicality. Before she could respond, there was a knock at their door. Opening it, they found Maria from the cafeteria standing there, holding a large envelope. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Maria said, stepping inside. "But something amazing happened today at the courthouse, and I couldn't wait until tomorrow to tell you." She explained that word had spread about the Thompsons' situation, and courthouse employees had organized a fundraiser. The envelope contained not just money, but also pledges from local businesses to help the family get back on their feet. "The community wants to help," Maria explained, "but they also want to teach you how to prevent this situation from happening again." The next day, Patricia found herself sitting in Judge Wilson's chambers during her lunch break. The judge had arranged for a financial advisor, Mrs. Chen, to meet with them. To Patricia's surprise, Keisha was invited to join them. "Financial literacy is a family matter," Mrs. Chen explained, spreading out some simple charts. Even children should understand basic money management. For the next hour, they discussed budgeting, savings, and the importance of emergency funds. Mrs. Chen showed them how to track expenses and set aside small amounts each week for future needs. Judge Wilson sat quietly, occasionally nodding in approval. Remember, Mrs. Chen said, it's not about how much money you make, but how wisely you manage it. Meanwhile, Tommy had become the courthouse mascot. The security guards kept a special eye on him, and even the sternest lawyers couldn't help smiling when he waved at them. Today, he sat in the cafeteria, teaching his stuffed bear how to count using the cookies Maria had given him. The afternoon brought another surprise. Mr. Mason arrived at the courthouse with exciting news. His wife, a retired teacher, had been tutoring Keisha during quiet periods at the store, and she'd noticed something special. Keisha has a gift for mathematics, Mr. Mason announced proudly. She's been helping us optimize our inventory system, and she's already spotted patterns that we missed. Judge Wilson listened intently as Mr. Mason explained how Keisha had suggested reorganizing the store's layout based on customer shopping patterns she'd observed. Her community service had unexpectedly revealed a talent for business analytics. We'd like to offer her a paid position after her community service ends, Mr. Mason said. Part-time, of course, so it won't interfere with her studies. Patricia watched her daughter's face light up at this news, remembering how just a month ago they'd felt hopeless and alone. Now, opportunities seemed to appear daily, not as handouts, but as chances to grow and contribute. Later that evening, as the courthouse was closing, Judge Wilson called the Thompson family into his chambers one more time. He had been working on something special, a long-term plan to ensure their stability. The fundraiser money will help with immediate needs, he explained. But what you really need is a foundation for the future. He outlined a program that combined financial assistance with education and skill development. Local businesses had agreed to provide mentoring, and the community college offered scholarships for both Patricia and Keisha. This isn't charity, the judge emphasized, seeing Patricia's hesitation. This is investment in human potential. We believe in your family. As they left the courthouse that evening, Patricia held her children's hands tightly. The setting sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps, but for the first time in months, the shadows didn't seem threatening. We're going to be okay, aren't we, Mom? Keisha asked softly. Patricia looked at her daughter, then at Tommy, who was happily skipping beside them. Yes, she said firmly. We're going to be more than okay. To be continued. 3 months had passed since that first day in court, and autumn had given way to winter. The Thompson family's apartment now felt like a real home, with warm blankets on the beds and food in the cupboards. But the biggest change wasn't in their living space, it was in their sense of purpose. On this cold December morning, Patricia stood in front of her computer class, giving a presentation on what she had learned. Her hands no longer shook when typing, and her voice carried confidence as she demonstrated a spreadsheet she had created to track the courthouse cafeteria's inventory. Patricia has become one of our star students, Sarah, the instructor, told the new class members. She's proof that it's never too late to learn new skills. Across town at Mason's Corner Store, Keisha was implementing her new inventory system. The store had been transformed under her and Mr. Mason's collaboration. Fresh produce now filled the front displays, and healthy snacks were positioned at child height. A suggestion Keisha had made based on her own experience. Remember when you used to hide from me? Mr. Mason asked teasingly as Keisha calculated the day's orders. Now you're teaching me new ways to run my own store. Keisha smiled, remembering how different things had been just a few months ago. Her school grades had improved dramatically, and her math teacher had recommended her for advanced classes next semester. The same mind that had once plotted how to steal food was now solving complex problems and helping others. At the courthouse, Tommy had his own special corner in the cafeteria, complete with a small desk where he practiced his letters while waiting for his mother to finish work. Maria had hung his artwork on the walls, creating a colorful display that brightened everyone's day. Future artist in the making, Maria would tell visitors proudly, as if Tommy were her own grandson. Judge Wilson maintained his daily visits to check on the family, though they hardly needed supervision anymore. Today, he found Patricia during her break, excitedly showing him her latest computer certification. I never thought I'd say this, Patricia admitted, but losing my factory job might have been the best thing that happened to us. It forced us to grow in ways we never imagined. The judge nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes our greatest challenges become our greatest opportunities for change. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. A local news reporter visited the courthouse, having heard about the Thompson family's story. She wanted to write an article about how one judge's compassion had transformed not just a family, but an entire community's approach to helping those in need. "No," Judge Wilson said firmly when interviewed. "This isn't about me. It's about what happens when people choose to see beyond the surface of a problem." Keisha wasn't just a hungry child stealing food. She was a bright young girl who needed a chance. Patricia wasn't just an unemployed mother. She was a hardworking woman who needed support to rebuild. The reporter watched as courthouse employees greeted the Thompsons like family, as customers at Mason's store sought out Keisha's advice, and as Tommy charmed everyone with his innocent joy. She saw how the community had woven the family into its fabric, creating a support system that went far beyond charity. Later that day, Patricia attended her first community council meeting. She had been invited to share her experience and help develop programs for other families facing similar challenges. As she stood at the podium, she saw Judge Wilson in the audience, nodding encouragingly. "3 months ago, I was too ashamed to ask for help," Patricia began. "I thought I had failed as a mother because I couldn't feed my children. But what I've learned is that true strength isn't in struggling alone, it's in accepting help and then using that help to grow stronger." As she spoke, Keisha sat in the audience, holding Tommy's hand. She remembered the hunger that had driven her to steal, but now understood that hunger came in many forms. Yes, there was physical hunger, but there was also hunger for knowledge, for purpose, for community. The Thompsons were no longer hungry in any of these ways. They had found not just food for their bodies, but nourishment for their souls in the connections they'd made and the purpose they discovered. To be continued. 6 months had now passed since Keisha first stood in Judge Wilson's courtroom. Winter had melted into spring, bringing new beginnings for the Thompson family. The local newspaper article about their story had sparked something unexpected, a movement across the city to rethink how communities could help struggling families. One sunny morning, Patricia stood in front of a crowd gathered at the community center. She had been asked to speak at the launch of the Neighborhood Bridges program, an initiative inspired by her family's journey. The program would connect struggling families with resources and opportunities before their situations became desperate. "When my daughter stole food that day," Patricia began, her voice strong and clear, "I thought it was the worst moment of our lives. Instead, it became the beginning of our transformation. But not every family should have to reach that breaking point to find help." In the audience, Keisha sat proudly watching her mother. She was wearing a new dress, not secondhand this time, bought with money she had earned from her part-time job at Mason's store. Beside her, Tommy fidgeted in his new clothes, occasionally waving at familiar faces in the crowd. Judge Wilson, seated in the front row, remembered the frightened girl who had stood before him 6 months ago. Now, Keisha was preparing to skip a grade in math and had started a lunch buddy program at her school to make sure no student went hungry during the day. After the speech, Mr. Mason approached the podium to make an announcement. His store had become a model for other local businesses, showing how they could play a role in community support. He had started a program where customers could prepay for food items that would be available to families in need. "The day Keisha took food from my store," Mr. Mason said, adjusting his glasses, "I thought I was dealing with a simple case of theft. Instead, I gained an amazing employee, a brilliant young business partner, and most importantly, a wake-up call about what our community really needed." The crowd applauded as Mr. Mason revealed that 5 other local stores had joined the program. Each would offer job training and employment opportunities, following the model that had worked so well with the Thompsons. Maria from the courthouse cafeteria then shared how her team had expanded their operation to include a free breakfast program for children, inspired by Tommy's morning visits. The little boy had become the face of the program, his smile featured on posters promoting healthy eating. Meanwhile, the computer training program where Patricia had learned her new skills was now offering classes in the evenings and on weekends, making it accessible to more working parents. Sarah, the instructor, proudly announced that Patricia would be helping teach the introductory classes. Sometimes, Judge Wilson said when it was his turn to speak, Justice isn't about punishment. It's about recognizing human dignity and potential. The Thompson family has taught us that when we invest in people, the returns are immeasurable. After the ceremony, as people mingled and shared refreshments, a young mother approached Patricia quietly. "I'm in the same situation you were," she whispered. "I don't know how to ask for help." Patricia immediately took the woman's hand. "Then let me show you how," she said warmly. "That's why we're here." Later that evening, the Thompson family sat in their apartment, which now felt truly like home. Photos hung on the walls: Keisha with her math competition trophy, Tommy's first day of kindergarten, Patricia receiving her computer certification. Each image told part of their story. "Mom," Keisha said suddenly, "remember when you used to skip meals so Tommy and I could eat?" Patricia nodded, pulling both her children close. "Those days seem like a different lifetime now." "They were," Keisha agreed, "but I'm glad we don't forget them. They help us understand how to help others." Tommy looked up from his coloring book. "Is that why we give food to other kids now? Because we remember being hungry?" "That's exactly right, sweetheart," Patricia answered, her voice full of emotion. "We remember so we can help others find their way forward." Through their window, they could see the courthouse where their journey had begun. Its imposing structure no longer seemed threatening. Instead, it stood as a reminder that sometimes the darkest moments could lead to the brightest futures. To be continued. 1 year had passed since that life-changing day in Judge Wilson's courtroom. The Thompson family gathered with the entire community to celebrate the first anniversary of the Neighborhood Bridges program. The courthouse steps, where Keisha had once stood in fear, were now decorated with balloons and banners. Judge Wilson, his hair a little grayer but his eyes still kind, stood at the podium addressing the crowd. 1 year ago, a hungry child taught us all a lesson about justice, compassion, and community. Today, we celebrate not just the Thompson family's success, but the success of our entire community in looking after its own. The statistics spoke for themselves. In the past year, the program had helped over 200 families avoid crisis situations. Mr. Mason's store model had spread to 15 other businesses across the city. The courthouse cafeteria, under Maria's leadership, now served free meals to an average of 50 children each day. Patricia, dressed in a smart business suit, sat in the front row. She had recently been promoted to office manager at a local company, her computer skills and determination earning her a position she never thought possible. Her eyes filled with tears as she watched Keisha take the stage. "A year ago, I was so hungry that I stole food," Keisha began, her voice strong and clear. "Today, I'm proud to announce that our school lunch buddy program has expanded to every school in the district. No child in our community will ever have to feel that desperate again." At 13, Keisha had become an inspiration to many. Her math skills had earned her a scholarship to a prestigious summer program, and she spent her free time tutoring younger students. Mr. Mason had made her an official junior manager at his store, where she continued to innovate and improve systems. Tommy, now 5 and starting kindergarten, sat between his mother and Maria, proudly wearing a t-shirt that read "Community Helper in Training." His artwork still decorated the courthouse cafeteria, but now it shared space with drawings from other children who came for meals and found friendship there. As the ceremony continued, families stepped forward to share their stories. A single father who had found work through the program, a grandmother who now had help caring for her grandchildren, a teenager who had followed Keisha's example and started a food pantry at his high school. Mr. Mason, who had become like a grandfather to the Thompson children, announced that his store's prepaid food program had served over 1,000 meals to families in need. "And not one instance of theft," he added with a wink at Keisha, "because now people know they can ask for help." The computer training program where Patricia had started her journey had grown into a full-fledged career development center. Sarah proudly reported that over 300 people had completed training and found better jobs, with Patricia serving as a mentor to many. Judge Wilson saved the biggest announcement for last. "Today, we're launching the Hope Scholarship Fund," he declared. "This fund will ensure that children from struggling families have access to educational opportunities and enrichment programs. And our first recipient," he paused, smiling, "is Keisha Thompson, who will be attending an advanced mathematics program this summer." The crowd erupted in applause as Keisha hugged her mother, both of them crying happy tears. Tommy ran up to join them, creating a family embrace that symbolized everything the program stood for: hope, unity, and the power of community. As the celebration wound down, Patricia found a quiet moment with Judge Wilson. "I never properly thanked you," she said softly. "Not just for helping us, but for seeing us, really seeing us, when we needed it most." The judge shook his head. "You did all the hard work," he replied. "You and Keisha showed us what courage looks like. You reminded us that true justice includes compassion." Later that evening, the Thompson family walked home together through their neighborhood. The same streets that had once felt hostile now felt welcoming. Neighbors called out greetings, and children played safely under the community's watchful eye. At home, Patricia watched as Keisha helped Tommy with his numbers, teaching him the same way Judge Wilson had once helped her with fractions using sandwich portions. On their wall hung a framed copy of the newspaper article that had started it all, its headline now a reminder of how far they'd come. "Black girl tells judge that she is hungry. What he did next left everyone in shock." Below it, someone had added a new line. "And together, they built a bridge of hope." The end.